I'm back. Where were we? Hi. Oh, you're gonna get a visitor. Hello. Okay. Hello. I know, you need some attention too, don't you? You want to hear all about Roman drama? I'm about to tell all these people about Roman drama. Oh, it's right in my mouth. This dog is so big. So, that period of time between 400 and about 600, 400 BC, as I said, produced a lot of really fantastic drama. By the way, if you haven't had the blueberry Waterloos, I highly recommend them. Anywho, so eventually the Greeks were conquered by the Romans. The Romans were excellent at things like engineering and architecture, and also stealing every idea from every other culture and consuming them into their own culture, right? So when the Roman Empire would conquer a land, they would say, "We rule you now, but you can stay just as you are. All we ask is that you worship Caesar. Excuse me, and recognize Caesar as your emperor, right? Or whoever it was." But they would basically assimilate all of the cultural things from individual cultures into their own culture. And so they did that with Greek theater, and they basically just copied it. Roman writers, tragedy writers like Seneca, just basically took the work of Euripides and Sophocles and rewrote it into their own plays. The most famous, though, of the Roman theater practices were the comedies of Terence and Plautus, who also took a lot of liberties with Greek comedy, the work of Aristophanes and others as well, and Menander. But they were extremely popular, and most of their plays have survived, actually. We have a lot of them. In fact, I have a book of their plays on my shelf in there. As I said, the preeminent dramatist was Seneca, and they were all extremely popular and admired by writers and audiences during the Renaissance as well. In fact, when the Renaissance and when neoclassicism kicked in, and the rediscovering of the classics, many people looked to the works of Terence and Plautus and Seneca as format for the way that they were going to create drama. Obviously, nothing lasts forever, and Rome did not. It fell in 476 AD. Roman theater as a thing would not last either. It mostly just descended into spectacle and just bawdy comedy and watching people get eaten by lions. Stuff like that. And so theater would kind of disappear, and it brought the classical era of theater to an end. And many of those things would not arise again until the discovery and establishment of the neoclassical ideal in places like Italy and France in the 14th and 15th centuries, in the 15th, 16th century. So when Rome fell, classical theater disappeared. A new drama would reappear in about the 10th century. So for about 400 years, during what we call the Dark Ages, everything just kind of descended into nation states and feudal lands, right? There really wasn't a centralized sense of power or authority, politically, religiously, whatever it may be. As the Catholic Church became a thing and spread from Rome throughout the former Roman Empire and into medieval Europe, Eventually, Western drama would reappear in the form of liturgical drama. It was an altogether different product than the theater of Sophocles and Seneca. That can't be overstated. It was very different. And it was sponsored by the same church, the Christian church, the Catholic Church, that had essentially forbidden it once Rome became Christianized in the late Empire. Because that's part of the reasons why it went away. Was that it was viewed as something that was sinful and gaudy and sexual and so on and so forth. Given who it was worshiping, the god of wine and fertility, the party god. And so they outlawed it. And so it went away. And when it came back as a form of theater that was sanctioned by the church and sponsored by the church and used by the church to teach the Bible and to teach the biblical stories, because most people during that time were illiterate. There were no universities yet. And so the only people who could read were the religious leaders in Latin. The church was the center of learning, and it was the monk's job to teach the people what they needed to know about Jesus and the Bible and resurrection and sin and death, morality, all that stuff, right? So how did they do that? Well, it started as small portions of church services. In fact, the earliest known theater of that time was a very small call and response portion of an Easter service known as the Quim Quertus. Actually, I believe it's Quim Quiritus. And it is a retelling of the story of the three Marys when they visit the empty tomb of Jesus. It was a simple liturgical skit in which they would come in and they would say, "Hey, the tomb is empty. Where is he?" And the angel would come in and say, "He is not here. He has been raised." And then they would all break into hallelujah choruses, and that was it. Well, that was the first step back into the foray of theater and performance during that time period. And that was the first of literally hundreds of church-sponsored dramatization depicting and celebrating traditional Judeo-Christian stories. Let's see, where am I? Yes. So it's kind of stayed that way, sort of stayed inside the church service until about 1250 AD. And it finally, as they grew in prominence and in spectacle and so on and so forth, kind of moved outside and started getting, it was first into the churchyard, and then it would move from there into the streets and into towns and then into tours and all kinds of things like that. At which point they changed from what we would consider early liturgical drama, or drama that was part of the liturgy, into what we call religious vernacular drama. Why do we separate it from liturgical and vernacular? Well, because the early liturgical dramas were done in Latin as a part of the church service of the Mass or the Hours service, things like that. Vernacular drama was done in common tongue. And those plays were called the mystery plays. Those productions were meant to tell biblical stories, not just little skits as a part of call and response things in the service, but actual you know, the story of Adam and Eve, the story of the garden, the story of Noah, the story of Moses, whatever it might be. And they started getting done at festivals again. It was around this time that theater sort of became a community activity once again. Festivals like the Feast of Corpus Christi, and other festivals where European towns would have an entire cycle of plays performed. It would last many days, and these cycles would be 2 or 3 or 4 days long, as opposed to just the trilogy of Greek tragedies. They would do the entire Bible from start to finish. And inside that, it was a community event as well, right? The entire community would come together to build these, what they called mansions or wagons, pageant wagons that would pull these dramas along. They were done either on fixed or movable stages, depending on what was going on. And what was kind of fun about it is that if there was like a play, like for example, the Mystery of Noah, right? Well, the ships building guild would be responsible for putting on the Mystery of Noah, right? Or the story of the loaves and the fish, right? And Jesus, when he feeds the 5,000, the bakers and the fishermen would be responsible for putting that together. So everybody took a part in creating this really complex and large theatrical extravaganza that would go on for days, and audiences would stroll along from one place to the next, and these things were performed in sequence. They also sometimes were done on fixed stages, which would be as wide as 200 feet long. And you would, on one side, see the Garden of Eden, and on the other side, you'd see the judgment, and the final judgment, and sinners going into hell, and all that kind of stuff, and every story in between in order. It's fascinating. Interestingly, they still do a cycle play, the York Mystery Plays, in York, in Northern England, every 4 years. And I'm going to the next one, so I'm excited about that. That might be this summer, actually. Neither here nor there. So that idea of audiences moving from thing to thing is awfully similar to the earliest forms of drama that we see in Egypt with the Abydos Passion Play, right, of the resurrection of the god Osiris. So you see how these ideas are passed down and down and down and down? It's fascinating. Now, at first glance, those mystery plays, they might seem stylistically primitive, but 21st century productions have demonstrated some of their techniques, those medieval techniques in their productions still today. They were spectacles to behold. Some of the things that they created and built and their special effects and stuff, the way that they thought about things, the way that they created things was really quite phenomenal. There are other types of medieval drama, just so you know. One is Passion Play, obviously, which tells the story of the death and resurrection of Jesus. The other would be something called a morality play, which is a play that teaches about the 7 deadly sins and the 7 heavenly virtues. An example of that would be the play Everyman, which you might have heard about at some point in English class. But it tells the story of every man and his journey through the 7 deadly sins and his coming to understand virtue and that he can only take his virtues with him into eternal life. Some of the most famous of the mystery plays would be the Mystery of Noah, the Mystery of Adam. The most famous is probably the Second Shepherd's Play, which tells the story of the 3 shepherds and the night where they saw the star, the Christmas star. That one's real famous, and it's used often as an example of medieval mystery drama. So once we got into like the 13th and 14th century, the Renaissance hit, right? in many ways, medieval drama was created in a sort of vacuum, right? It was made essentially from scratch, completely unaware of its classical predecessors, of the traditions of the Greeks and the Romans that have come before them. They made, as I said earlier, a product that was completely their own. In the High Middle Ages, which was, 1300s, Greek and Roman texts began to be translated and published, and their influence was overwhelming. It was during this period that a lot of classical ancient culture was reborn and infused with medieval values, and picked up the forms from there that have been dominant for centuries in the arts. Do you want to come out? Do you need to get out? Can you let her out? She's like, I'm tired of listening to theater history. I'm not interested. There goes the dog. So, by most accounts, the Renaissance began in Italy. When the plays of Plautus and Seneca were first translated. Now, we're talking specifically about theater. Now, there was obviously a Renaissance in art and architecture and things like that, which play a part in theater, but theater has its own little corner of the Renaissance universe, which is kind of what we're talking about. So those plays of Plautus and Seneca were translated and started to getting redone. And amateur productions of these plays started getting done, especially the comedies. And that got really popular and gave rise to kind of a free play, loosely followed improvisational version of those productions that are now known as commedia erudita, right? Or learned comedy. And that was the basis of what became commedia dell'arte, which is the most famous thing to come out of Italy from a performance standpoint. That and opera. Which opera obviously is a bigger deal than commedia, but much less interesting. So let's see, what do I want to talk to you about next? So in the 1520s, Niccolo Machiavelli, whom you might have read in literature class, Machiavelli, was famous throughout Italy for his commedia erudita that was based on his Roman forebears, as much of it was. And by around the middle of the 1500s or so, 1550s, there was a group of itinerant performers that essentially took the ideas and basically turned them into improv comedies, and that became commedia, as I told you. And that's sort of where the process in Italy stops, is from a theatrical standpoint, other than opera, which we won't talk about here because that's a whole other thing. It was in England that the Renaissance brought forth the greatest dramatic masterpieces of the age. And really in Western literature. And that was, of course, through the works of William Shakespeare. Now, the theater of the Renaissance in England featured dozens of playwrights whose work remained popular. Guys like Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, Thomas Kidd, John Webster, all these guys, John Ford, they all wrote Renaissance drama and comedy that are still well known and still produced on occasion, but none of them have equaled the work of Shakespeare. His plays are still the most produced dramas in the world to this day. Literally thousands of theaters around the world, and comprise the primary repertoire of more than 100 theater companies that are named after Shakespeare. The Royal Shakespeare Company, the National Shakespeare Theater, Shakespeare and Company in Massachusetts. That's all kinds of different places. Now, in that time, his plays were performed in open-air theaters that were essentially... It was essentially a descendant of a medieval mansion that they just took and built around it so that they could create audience area, right? I think I've showed some of you pictures of the Globe. In those plays, we kind of lost our idea of like costumes and makeup and masks. The costumes were just dress of the day. Minimal props and scenic elements were used, just things like banners and chairs and tables and stuff. The language was the focus, the primacy of the language and the text to allow the audience to understand where they were and what was going on. From there, we move into what we understand to be the neoclassical ideal, the plays of the 16th and 17th century. If the Renaissance was the rebirth of the classical civilization, the age that followed was a vast consolidation and refinement of what had come before, politically and intellectually, as emerging science, rational philosophies, and things like that sort of got built up around the increasing prominence of royalty and European royalty and aristocracy. The plays of this era, of that time period, were generally aimed at royalty, more so than general populace, and reflected the gentility of the seemingly refined taste of courtly patrons, right? They sought to, because of the introduction of the idea of science and reason and things, to incorporate really strict rubrics around what was acceptable in drama and what was not. And that became called the neoclassical ideal. This was also the Western world's first massive foray into theater commentary and criticism. We have a lot of evidence and reports from this time period of what was happening, who it was, what the productions were, what they looked like, what they felt like, the artistic lives, and the creative manifestos of the people who were involved in it. It's really interesting. This is where things get really detailed and specific. And because every era of theater is in some ways a rebellion against the ones that come before it, the Romantic era of theater, which happened after the 17th century in like the 18th and 19th centuries, that went on for a long time, and sort of the Victorian era, was in many ways an absolute rejection of rational decorum and sort of the neoclassical, whatever you want to call it, elegance and ordered functions of plays and things like that. Romanticism was floral, exotic, grotesque, sprawling, imbibed with free-flowing spirit, pirates and soldiers and warriors and all kinds of fun stuff. It gave rise to things like melodrama and grand opera, and supplied much of the anarchic passion and sprawling sentiment of modern realism. This idea that everything in the world is not ordered and should be a little more chaotic sort of launched into this time period through that. Also, interestingly, the Romantic quest for foreign and exotic things, as colonization was happening, travel, people started to get mobile, big the era of big ships, you know what I mean, and people starting to travel and see the world. That gave rise to an interest in things that were foreign from what he'd ever seen before. And that was the Western drama's first interaction with and engagement with the theater of the East. And at this point, I'm going to stop and start a new one, and we'll do Theater of the East. So come back for Theater Traditions Part 3. I'm stopping here at the Romantic period because the modern theater is its own chapter. And so we're going to pick that up next week.